It's now my pleasure to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Dr. Kate Holbrook, who is a managing historian in the LDS Church History Department. She has been a leading voice in the study of Mormon women and Mormon foodways. As managing historian, she writes, studies, and interprets history full-time. Her major research interests are religion, gender, and food. Kate grew up at the feet of the Rocky Mountains and is happy to live there again, among the historic sites, cultural currents, and food environments where her scholarship has its roots. She has a bachelor's in English and Russian literature from Brigham Young University, a master's from the Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD in religious studies from Boston University. She and her husband, Sam Brown, have 3 daughters and live in Salt Lake City. I've had the chance to get to know her a little bit today, and I can absolutely say that she is a wonderful human. She's kind, insightful, and thoughtful, and I hope we can all learn a little bit from her today. Dr. Kate Holbrook.
It seems to me that you're all majoring in music. I feel that I've been transported to the heavenly realm tonight, and I thank you for sharing your gifts. Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing is one of my very favorite hymns, and that rendition was astonishingly beautiful. Because I work at the Church History Department, people often ask me about historical issues that they and their students or their children find disconcerting. I spoke with the LDSSA about this today at lunch, last week at Weber State University, and a year ago in a broadcast watched by a few 100,000 church members. My department puts a lot of effort into helping people, church members and not, to obtain accurate, reliable information about church history. And I hope that those materials will be helpful to those of you who care about church history. I know that church history is not the only source of the questions that come up in your lives. Doctrine is, current practice is, and life is. If you're engaged in life, if you take thinking seriously, then you're going to experience psychic dissonance. Even when you feel that you've received them, you still will wonder how answers to prayer work. You will wonder how best to fill your mission on earth in the face of overwhelming human suffering and your own limitations. You will wonder about the overwhelming question, and I'm being serious here, of what to eat for dinner in light of your budget, your health, your companions, your pleasure, global warming, and global hunger. So I invite you to consider tonight some useful questions that can help us think through the dissonance of these issues that bubble to the surface for us and demand our attention. This is not a magic formula I'm selling tonight, but questions that I think are useful, and it's useful to ask more than one of them when we have those moments of dissonance. Before we proceed, I have to say something to try to compensate for what made me wary about talking about this tonight. Every person will have different issues. Life is so rife with paradox that you should never feel that there are certain topics you should suffer over, even if they don't naturally cause you suffering. You don't have to have questions about church history or doctrine. You don't have to manufacture a spiritual crisis in order to feel that your faith has been amply intellectually grounded. Please don't feel that you are somehow incomplete if you don't care very much about the Book of Abraham translation process or the early history of Latter-day Saint plural marriage practices. Don't borrow other people's questions, because the questions that genuinely fascinate you will be the ones you can most fruitfully explore. Whatever you think of these useful questions that I'm proposing tonight, make sure you look up Julie Willis's fantastic discourse called Gaining Light Through Questioning. It's available for those of you who have the Gospel Library app. It's online for free, and it's a fantastic exploration of how we learn through the process of questioning. The first useful question I propose is to consider your feelings. When we encounter a hard question, we respond with feelings and thoughts all mixed up together. I think it's hard to discern what the question really is before I've observed my feelings, which is why I put this as the first question. At least since the Enlightenment, people have pretended they could separate out thought from feeling and only deal with thought, but that's false. Both thoughts and feelings will motivate our questions, and honest analysis will consider both. It's helpful to sit with feelings and name them. Think about where they might be coming from. Feelings often have patterns, although they don't come in logical, well-organized packages. What are some of the feelings people mention when they experience a faith crisis? I hear words such as betrayal, anger, hurt, defensiveness. What might the story be behind these feelings? Why would something make you feel betrayed? Why would something make you feel hurt? Why do you feel angry? We don't need to solve the feelings, but do observe them, and if you're able, you can both observe and analyze. The observation is just that, paying attention to what's going on inside of you. I just had a conversation with someone that's made my heart race and filled me with a sense of dread. I think I feel threatened by what she said. Or my ministering brother just left and I don't feel like doing anything. The color has gone out of life. I think our conversation left me feeling depressed. The analysis might look like this. Why did I feel mad at my mom when my Baptist roommate told me about God answering her prayer? That response does not make sense to me. But maybe I felt angry because my mom has been a major influence on my spiritual life, and her definition of our church being a true church doesn't account for people who aren't church members having answers to their prayers. Why did she teach me something so rigid? And then, maybe she was rigid out of a fearful love. She wanted to protect my faith. She wanted me to have a good life. She didn't want to lose her faith. She wanted to be a good mother. It may have been a broken response my mother gave me, but in some way, her rigidity was a byproduct of her love. So after you've observed your feelings, maybe brought some analysis to your feelings, ask yourselves, what's my real question? Just as you can't successfully test a theory until you've carefully defined what research question your theory is meant to answer, you can make more significant progress on a spiritual question when you've narrowed your galloping thoughts and feelings to something more specific. For the process of thinking through these useful questions tonight, I'm going to borrow a subject that my young friend asked about a couple of months ago, just before leaving for her first year at Cornell University. My friend has been a church member for a little under 2 years, and she wondered about the teaching that the church is true, and how she might go about talking about that with other people. For this talk, I'm going to narrow her question a little bit and have it say, what does it mean, what might it mean to say the church is true? Now let's be very clear that I am not going to do justice to this question in 20 minutes. The main takeaway I hope you have from this talk is some new ways of thinking about your response to cognitive dissonance or questions arising from church history, doctrine, or practice. The next question, after you focus your question, is what context should I consider to help me approach this question? First, think about the fact that many religious groups make a similar claim to having truth in their traditions. Groups start because people think they have a better interpretation than the old ways. And in religion, that better interpretation often comes through inspiration from God. Muhammad, for example, received divine messages that led to a religion both he and his followers thought superior to their tribal traditions. There's a reason someone might choose to be Methodist over Presbyterian. Even the syncretistic religion of Unitarianism, people choose because they think it's better. There's something more for them that resonates better with them in that tradition. If you're honest about the fact that choosing one thing at some level means you think it is the best choice, then how do you proceed? I think the useful way to proceed, the loving way to proceed, is to focus on what your church has to offer, acknowledge the good there, be grateful for the good there, and try to magnify the good that is there. Another aspect of context we might consider for this particular question is post-Enlightenment thought, the context in which we move and breathe now. Before the Enlightenment, the question of whether your church was true would have been answered by whether you find God in it, whether the church bound you to other people through ritual and service. But post-Enlightenment thought tries to force religion to treat its claims about the world as if they were scientific experiments, which is like asking your spouse to prove their love for you by conducting a scientific experiment. It's the wrong category. It's the wrong kind of question. I am fairly certain that many of you approach the question about whether the church is true in this post-Enlightenment way because you've been taught to, both within and without the church. Many church thinkers approach the question this way, and we've learned something from their insights, but there's another way to think about this. The more useful analytical approach, in my view, is to practice fidelity and to notice what follows. Jesus talked about this in terms of fruit trees, and I imagine maybe some of you know your local peach grower, Masumoto, the beautiful fruit. Analyze the fruit that's coming from the tradition to which you're practicing fidelity. What does fidelity mean? What does fidelity look like? It looks like looking for the best in each other, forgiving each other, being present with each other, praying about our own fears, questions, shortcomings, and also praying for other people. I asked my daughters during a road trip to help me brainstorm some of the fruits that they have found and that I have found in this particular church. We had Heavenly Mother. We had the grace of salvation where people are taught about Christ and the atonement again and again and again in this life and the next, and have the opportunity to enjoy that fruit again and again. We thought about the welfare program. We thought about LDS charities. We thought about a rotating hierarchy and the fact that somebody one day could be a stake president and the next day work in the nursery. We love. There's so much to love here. Those are two contexts relevant to the question. You might think of others. The next useful question is, what is at stake for me here? Do I benefit from the answer coming out a particular way? Does someone else who's influencing me benefit from the answer coming out a particular way? Just because there's self-interest involved in the question doesn't mean that should shape your answer, but it's really important to be aware that the self-interest is there. Hold it as you're holding your analysis of your feelings. What is at stake for me here can be a very personal question. I don't know what was at stake for my young friend on her way to Cornell. When you're doing this work in the privacy of your own mind and with your own pen, don't skip that question. Next is, what evidence am I using to figure out an answer to my question? Now, as a historian, we think carefully about I know you all think carefully about evidence. In history, we need multiple sources for our evidence to feel that it's grounded. So we get excited when we have a journal entry because it tends to be written around the time that something actually took place. That's similar to a newspaper article. It's recorded at the time something took place. So it's more reliable than a memoir in that way. But a journal and a newspaper article also reflect one person's perspective. So then that's the con to that kind of evidence. So you look for different types of evidence to try to get a better picture of what happened and what it might have been like. With spiritual questions, we use even a broader range of sources. We think about prayer. We think about our spiritual instincts. We think about what we find when we study scripture. Think about what we find when we study teachings of leaders. we think about historical evidence. Remember to ask yourself, how solid, what are the pros and cons of the evidence I'm using? I heard a quotation when I was a child that has profoundly shaped the choices I've made in my life and my attitude to this beautiful world and all of the beautiful things that I embrace in it. What I vaguely heard and remembered was Brigham Young, the second president of the church, saying, "There's truth everywhere, and you should go find it and embrace it and bring it to add to what you have found at church." And as I've been preparing for this talk, I thought, well, I should look that up and see whether he actually said anything like that. So I asked my colleague, Legine Carruth, to help me. Legine Carruth is an expert in Pittman shorthand, and she translates early church leaders, the transcripts, the shorthand records of their speeches for us. What you may have read about early church leaders' words in 19th century Utah, you probably would have read in the Journal of Discourses. And we found that there were a lot of liberties taken by those people who were transcribing, not only taking the shorthand notes, but then transcribing them into longhand. So when we looked to Legine for our quotations because we feel like they're a little closer to what actually was said. So this is the quotation that Legine was able to find for me. This is Brigham Young speaking. "The church embraces every science upon the earth. Every knowledge that is imparted to men is from God and is within our religion. There is no truth that has ever been revealed that we do not believe, and at the same time, when people are disposed to point out errors, we are willing to acknowledge we have errors." What does true church seem to mean to Brigham Young here? That he thinks there is space in the church for whatever scientific religious discoveries come along. We'll make space for them. There is truth everywhere, and this church will try to function as a collecting house for truth. God is the source of truth. The church will have errors. We should be open to correction and new information. There's some real spiritual confidence in this quotation. And there's also some humility. There's a truest church, and even so, we bumbling humans aren't going to get everything right. Also, our members and our leaders are not going to be the sole source of truth. God will reveal truth elsewhere, and we are still beholden to that truth, even though it doesn't come from us. There are similar words in my favorite article of faith, the 13th article of faith there at the end. "If there is anything of good report, lovely, or praiseworthy, we seek after these things." And just to give you hope that it wasn't only in those early founding days that we had this perspective, in 2015, our church president Nelson gave a talk at the dedication of a BYU Life Sciences building in which he said, "There is no conflict between science and religion." Thought you would like that. "Conflict only arises from an incomplete knowledge of either science or religion or both. All truth is part of the gospel of Jesus Christ, whether truth comes from a scientific laboratory or by revelation from the Lord. It is compatible." There's also evidence relevant to this question that we're wrestling with. What does it mean to be a true church? Regarding the literal restoration of priesthood, the power of God on the earth, and also continuing revelation to prophets. And I think for most of you, those are the more familiar aspects of this conversation, and so I've spent time on the less familiar aspects of the conversation. The next useful question is, how can I act from a place of strength? Sometimes when we are in a moment of crisis or cognitive dissonance, we want to curl up in a ball. We want to stop. We want to just watch TV. What does it mean to act from a place of strength? It means to study. It means to act. It means to serve people. It means to get out of bed. My husband Sam came to faith at age 18, and he decided when he did that he would never make a decision that influenced the practice of faith, the way he would follow faith in his life when he wasn't feeling close to God. Because if he was feeling close to God, he could trust that the decision he was making was one that would be fruitful. Provide delicious peaches instead of mushy, undelicious peaches. And on the same topic, I would just like to give you a quotation by Elaine Jack, who was the Relief Society General President from 1990 to 1997. In a talk she entitled "Get a Life," a talk to BYU students, she explained that there is a process. Faith is a process, and we have to be involved in the process. Standing outside of the process doesn't increase faith. This is the way she said it. She said, personal faith requires strength and is a source of strength at the same time. You need to be participating in order to get an understanding and a sense of growth through the process you're involved in. Okay, final question is, what is the loving thing to do? A psychology professor at BYU named Aaron Jackson likes to answer the question of what to do by asking, what is the loving thing to do? Sometimes that question is enough. Sometimes the loving thing is obvious, and other times that's a really hard question. But if you're stumped after working through our other questions, then maybe the most productive way forward is, for the time being, to ask yourself, what is the loving thing to do? I think much of our discomfort over the true church claim is because that claim, at times, we worry is not loving. For some people, the security of belonging to a true church is appealing. For many of us, it creates some psychological discomfort. We don't want to be arrogant. We don't want to blind ourselves to the goodness of other people. And we don't want them to feel that we don't see their goodness. There's a quotation from a man who was an apostle of the church in the first half of the last century, Orson F. Whitney. And at a general conference, for those of you who feel that way, this was something he said that I think is comforting. He said, God is using more than one people for the accomplishment of his great and marvelous work. The Latter-day Saints cannot do it all. It is too vast, too arduous for any one people. The Gentiles are our partners, in a certain sense. Now, I'm about to conclude with the point that's really important to me, but before I do, I want to be clear about something, just so that no one misrepresents me on Twitter. I don't just study this church, I live it. It's something I've studied carefully, compared with other options, and chosen with my eyes open. When I say I believe the church is true, I mean that I believe God is in this church, that both the leaders and members receive inspiration from God according to their stewardships. I believe that the power of God, which we call the priesthood, which both women and men access, is in this church. I've felt it, I've seen it, and my professional life immerses me in sources that reinforce it. My church life reinforces it. My family life, which I hold particularly dear, reinforces it. And now that I've said that, I want to talk about an additional layer of what it might mean to say this church is true. I think there is something aspirational about calling this church true. It should try to be true. It will take work to be true. We members have a commission to make it true. I believe we experience this aspirational layer of truth in the church when we forgive each other, when we are present with each other, when we serve each other. A year ago, when I was preparing for a satellite broadcast, I read hundreds of questions submitted by young people from around the world. Some of the questions said that a person read her scriptures, prayed, obeyed the commandments, and still didn't feel an assurance that the church was true. I felt sad about the pain of those questions, and disappointed that so many of them had missed understanding that helping and loving others should have been on the list, They are a crucial part of nourishing faith. Tonight, I have focused on introspection and thinking as they relate to faith, but I want to leave you with my statement of faith that we find God in doing good for other people. I have learned the most about Jesus when I have tried to do the work of Jesus. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.